Hi everyone, my name is Della Phillips. I'm an artist as well as I'm known as a bicycle lady. How you doing today? I'm doing great. Hope you're doing great too. First, I want to thank you for selecting to watch this video. I really appreciate it. Now, what I have on my desk is a stack of results from the prior videos testings of the watercolor markers, they're pigment-based markers, Winsor Newton Pro Marker, watercolor marker, as well as a couple of the Faber-Castell Albrecht Durer watercolor markers. Now, there were differences when you use the marker on various papers. My goal when I started this testing was to find a paper or papers in which I could use applying from the marker itself directly onto the paper, then being able to blend it out with water to a flat wash where there would be no application lines. So let's look at the results that were obtained. To help with looking at the results, I did put together a table or a chart of all the results. They're about 4 pages long. I have this in a PDF. I'm going to see if I can post this on the community page. If that's not feasible, then we'll look at possible other options. That way you can have access to this chart. Okay? I put all the papers that I've tested in alphabetical order. And the first one is the Arch hot press. I'm sure you can see that just about every one of these do have the application lines that did not blend out. And I was a little bit disappointed. And I did put a little extra swatch. I took a graphite pencil and just lightly went across the top so you can see how smooth it is in the grain. I did that with all the samples. Now all the samples I have here, except for the marker paper, which you'll see coming up with Strathmore, is 140 pounds and acid-free. And most of them are 100% cotton as well, but there are a couple of exceptions, or 3 exceptions at least I know of. Alright? So this is a no use. No go, no use. Let's take a look at the arch or arches, depending how you pronounce it, knot, also known as cold press. Here you can see, hopefully, the surface, the coarseness of the cold press paper. You can see how super grainy it is, and if you were listening to it when your pencil went over, you could tell the coarseness of it. The good thing about this paper is it pretty much all blended out. I think here it's just maybe a slight haze, but I don't believe I did a good enough blending, because I've done others where everything totally blends out with the Arch cold press. So I would say this would be one I would use with caution because of the coarseness of the paper. That could be a little rough on your marker tips. If you're careful, that should not matter. So I would say this would be a definite in my use pile. Next, I had samples from Dick Blick, and thank you again, Dick Blick, for the samples you sent me. It's very nice of you, and I do appreciate it. I know there was some things going back and forth, but when customer service got involved, everything got straightened out, and I got paper samples. So thank you very much. And kudos to customer service and all Dick Blick. Here is the Blick watercolor paper. Now this is not 100% cotton. This is a recycled paper. It has, look up the descriptions. It is a cellulose with so much of it being recycled filaments and so forth. So it's basically a green type paper they talk about. However, using it with the markers and testing for blendability and not leaving application lines, this is a definitely do not use. It's soaked right in pretty much. Now for the Blick Premium paper, which is 140 pounds, and it is 100% cotton, it did blend out a bit more than the other one. However, you still get very defined lines on all of the colors. It didn't all blend out, so this again is do not use. Let's look at the next one. Now that was the hot press. This is the Dick Blick Premium Watercolor Paper Cold Press. I'll see if it does any better, because, you know, like we found that the hot press may do a little worse than the cold press, which actually surprised me initially. It didn't. It pretty much did the same thing as the hot press. Not hardly any difference there. So this is definite do not use. After the Blick papers, next comes the L'Aquarelle Canson Heritage. And with that I got the hot press, the cold press, and the rough. So as you can see on this, we did get some to blend out quite a bit. Still, there's very prominent lines. And it's not just with the sepia, which we all know by now is very infamous and it's hard to blend out. So this is a do not use. The interesting thing about this is 100% cotton, and they say it's sized internally and externally, but not using gelatin sizing. And you see the little graphite swatch hopefully there, and you can see how smooth it looks. Here's the other one, which is the Canson, the L'Aquarelle Canson Heritage Cold Press. Again, you're seeing about the same thing as what was seen on the hot press. Very defined lines, some blending, still a do not use. And the final sample of the L'Aquarelle Canson is the rough press. And as you can see, it even got maybe a little bit worse, but essentially it's the same thing. Very prominent lines, very little blending, so this is a definitely do not use. I know Canson is marketed sometimes where people will say it's like Arches, but performance-wise, we can see the difference here, at least when trying to use markers, directly applying the color to the paper and then blending it out. It does leave application lines, and that's not the goal, as we discussed earlier. The next paper that comes up is the Fabriano. This is a sample of the Fabriano hot press from a friend, thank you. And here you can see the texture. It just has a hint of a velvet surface on it. And as you can see, that it did blend essentially all totally out. I may have had some pooling because I didn't move some things around, but totally blended out. It did take a little bit more blending than the cold press, which I want to show you here in a minute. It's just a beautiful paper to work on. Very similar to his cold press, unlike some of the other brands like Arches, or you'll see later on. So this is definitely one you can use. Next one is the Fabriano Artistico Cold Press. Gorgeous. Absolutely no hint of lines. It took less blending. It went totally into a nice flat wash without any application lines remaining. So this is a definite use. The next one is a popular brand that many will use, which is the Fluid 100. Now this particular paper is 100% cotton, 140 pounds, cold press. You can see that the texture on the paper is a little bit coarse, not quite at the level of Arches or Arches, which a lot of people use and love. So I'll just kind of compare it back to that. As you can see, a lot of application lines are shown through all of it, very prominent. A little bit of blending, definitely a do not use. The next one that we tested was the Kilimanjaro. It is a lovely paper. It is not as coarse as the Arch. It's kind of like an in-between. Unfortunately, we did get some lines showing through from the application. A fairly decent blending. It's essentially a no use, unfortunately. Still a lovely paper. All these are wonderful papers. You just need the right paper properties for what you're doing and what medium you're using. Here is the Lana L'Aquarelle hot press. Now, my last video I told you I splurged and bought this because of the testing and how wonderful of experience I had with the cold press. You do get most of the colors totally blending out. There are a few that you do have application lines, especially like the sepia, the Prussian blue. So this is a marginal no use. It depends on what colors you're using, whether or not I would say go ahead and use it. Since with testing I have other options, I would say this would go into the no use. But it went into, officially would be a marginal no use, because it depends on the colors you're using, really, in this particular version of the Lana L'Aquarelle cold press. It is 140 pounds, 100% cotton. I mean hot press. Now here's the cold press. This was an absolute dream to work on. The Lana L'Aquarelle cold press 100% cotton. It does have a rougher texture, just a little step down below the coarseness of the Arch cold press. You still would need to be a little bit careful with the marker tips on it. It's not bad on the cold press. All the markers went into solution quickly, and I only did a couple of swipes. Maybe I should have done a little extra, one or two of these places, but it's gorgeous paper to work on. A definite yes, this would be an option to use. The next paper is the Legion paper. Legion paper is 100% cotton, 140 pounds. It is known to be a softer paper. For example, it's come out that you really can't use mask on it because it'll tear. It's good for certain techniques where you don't want the colors to move that much once you've had it on the paper. Like if you're doing a lot of glazing would be one example. Using with a marker where you apply the color directly from the marker onto the page essentially was do not use. Almost no movement. It sunk right in. So this is a definite no use. You had a similar result if you were using the Legion Stonehenge cold press. Just sunk right in, really. This is a fine cold press texture. I think you can see that from the graphite. Unfortunately, that's really you can't use it. It's just not going to even come close to doing blending out when you apply the color directly from the marker onto the page. Now, I have used the Legion Multimedia 100% cotton, and it depends on what colors you use. You can get some good blending with that. I'm told that the 100% multimedia paper is no longer available or not going to be made anymore. I don't know if that's true. If you know what's going on there, let me know, okay? Alright, so these are two do not use. Legion, do not use. Next is the Paul Rubens 100% cotton hot press paper. It is 140 pounds. Many people have shown this on YouTube as a possible economical paper. I got some several months ago just to try it out, just a sample from that blog. It seems to be pretty good paper with watercolor and possibly with the Neocolor too. So that's what I've used on it so far. And I've had some decent results. Unfortunately, with the watercolor markers, where you're applying the color directly to the page and then wanting to blend it out to a flat wash where you don't have the application lines, it's not going to work. You can definitely have application lines, and some of the blending of it is very little. So this is a do not use. Next up is the Saunders Waterfruit. It has a texture, cold press texture, that is kind of in between a really fine cold press texture and the coarse texture you find with the Arch, leaning a little more closer to the Arch. But it's not bad. It's very similar to the Fabriano, actually, in texture. Unfortunately, you can still see application lines, especially with certain colors. Other colors, there's a few that did totally blend out, but overall, this is a do not use. It's a wonderful paper, 140 pounds. It's been selected as a watercolor paper for many decades from the United Kingdom Royal Watercolor Society. It's a wonderful paper, but just not for this technique of applying watercolor marker color directly to the page and then blending out where it will not leave an application line. Now we come to the Strathmore. And I tested it several times. I really got a kick out of using the Strathmore. So when I got the hot press Strathmore 500 Imperial Series, I thought, well, it should work just like the cold press. I was surprised, just like what I was surprised with the Arch, difference between the hot press and cold press. It does work very well for almost all the colors. Sepia, you're still going to see a light application line, and also with the hooker's green. So this is a marginal do not use. It depends on the colors that you're going to be using in painting a artwork using the watercolor markers. With the other options that I've already shown that's good to use on, I would still put this in a do not use. Still wonderful paper. The next is one you saw me tout several times. It's the Strathmore 500 Series Imperial 100% cotton cold press. It is 140 pounds. And as you can see, all these blended out really close to effortlessly. Beautiful paper to work on with the marker, where you apply the marker color directly to the page and then blend it totally out to a flat wash. And you can see how well, after you let it sit for 15 minutes, it did blend out as well. It still leaves a line, but that is manageable and actually could lead to another technique that I can use in doing watercolor paintings with the watercolor markers. So that's very happy. So the Strathmore cold press is, yes, this is a definitely use. A hot press is do not use. Now with some Blick samples, they sent me marker paper. I didn't request it. I thought, well, maybe they know something I don't. So I went ahead and tested anyway. This is, what, around 50 pounds, I believe. It's a very smooth surface, as you can see from the graphite. And it is a cellulose paper. As you can see from the application lines, where you put the color directly onto the page, it does not totally blend out. You do see the application lines. This gray did appear like it almost totally, I think that did actually totally blend out. And the cadmium red came close, and possibly up there with the the scarlet red deep from Faber-Castell. Although I think there might be a hint of a line up there. So overall, I was pleasantly surprised by the performance of the paper. However, for this type of technique, it is still a do not use. Okay, next up on the paper samples was the Strathmore watercolor paper. I was given this book that Strathmore puts together, and then they hand out to their vendors. Given this book from Dick Blick. So thank you very much, Dick Blick. And in it, it has samples of all the watercolor papers. All the papers I've already had samples of and tested, so the only one I tested on was the 400. This is a cellulose paper, 140 pounds. It is acid free. I didn't have high hopes for it. The reason why I tested it is a lot of people love the Strathmore 400 watercolor journal. So I wanted to test it. The paper would be the same and see how it performed. I actually was pleasantly surprised. I thought it wouldn't perform that well being a cellulose paper. Some of the colors, a few of the colors did totally blend totally out, like the gray and the cad red, and I think also up there possibly is. I think that totally blended out. But when you're looking at the other colors, there's definitely application lines that did not blend out. You can see it coming through. Overall, this is a do not use. It doesn't mean it's bad paper. It's actually quite nice. And as far as using it for the marker technique of directly applying color to the page from the marker and then blending it totally out to a flat wash, it's a do not use. Next thing is the Winsor Newton samples that were actually provided by Winsor Newton. We talked about that before. Again, thank you, Winsor Newton. I really appreciate it. Plus, they gave me some extra papers, so we're going to have to use that in future videos, doing something maybe with the Cotman field box, or we'll come up with something else to paint together with, okay? These are the Winsor & Newton Professional Water Grade paper samples in which I tested the markers on. First is the hot press. As you can see, this would be a paper I would not use with the markers if I was going to want to use the direct application technique, then blend it out a flat wash without leaving application lines. The same is also true of the cold press. Now, not all colors did that on the cold press, but you still had colors that left applications like lines on both. Prominently is the sepia, the Prussian blue, and some of the others. There were colors that did not leave any lines, especially on the cold press. Mostly on the hot press, most of them did. For this type of technique with the watercolor markers with direct application, these would not be a paper I would use. It doesn't mean it's a bad paper. Actually, the Winsor Newton paper is actually a very nice and high quality paper. It's just not the right paper for this type of technique. What you see on the screen is a summary list of the papers I would use when creating art with the Winsor Newton Pro Marker watercolor marker or the Faber-Castell Albrecht Durer watercolor marker. Keep in mind both of these marker lines are artist grade and they're pigmented, so they do perform differently than your dye-based, water-based markers. So keep that in mind. That's the reason for all this testing. First up is the first on the list, which is the Fabriano Artistico 140 pound 100% cotton hot press. That's there because it has a smooth texture, slight velvet, and it does blend well. It does take a little more blending than the Fabriano Artistico 140 pound 100% cotton cold press. The cold press went into blending out much quicker than the hot press. Beautiful paperwork on there, both excellent. Then comes the Strathmore Imperial Series 500 140 pound 100% cotton cold press. That is a fine cold press paper. Essentially, the only reason the Fabriano was listed before the Strathmore is simply because of the hot press being a very smooth surface. Overall, those three are top picks and pretty darn close to being even to each other. Next would come the Lana Aquarelle Lana watercolor paper, 140 pounds, 100% cotton, cold press. It is absolutely a beautiful paper, premium paper to work on. The cold press is a medium texture cold press. It's a little more coarse than the Strathmore, but not as coarse and rough as the Arches watercolor paper, which I had on the last of the list. The Arches paper is still beautiful to work with, blends out totally. You're just going to have to be careful with your markers because with that type of coarse texture, you could wear your marker tips or possibly damage them if you're not careful. Now that we've gone through the list of the papers I would use when utilizing the Winsor Newton Pro Marker watercolor marker or the Faber-Castell Albrecht Durer watercolor markers in creating art, let's look at those actual results on those paper samples. Now I just put the arches to the side. Now that is my last choice on the list because, as I said, because of the roughness of the paper, even though everything blends out beautifully and easily. First on the list is these next two samples, and like I said, they're pretty even. That plus the Strathmore. That is the Fabriano Artistical papers, the hot press and the cold press. Right now I got my hand on the cold press. Now that's the hot press. It does take a little bit more to get everything blended out, but it does blend out. And it is a very nice paper to work on, very smooth, just a slight velvet surface. Now with the cold press, there is a moderate surface of cold press, but it blends out so wonderfully and is so beautiful to work on. Next would be the Strathmore cold press, and as I said before, it's pretty equivalent to the Fabriano. The only thing that's different because the Fabriano has a hot press that works well, and what brings it up pretty par to those is because it is a fine cold press texture, and it's just beautiful to work on and blends out so effortlessly. So that would be one of my top picks as well. The final one over to the right is the Lan Aquarelle, as you see to the right of my hand, and it is a beautiful paper to work on. It has a moderately coarse texture for a cold press, unlike the fine texture of the Strathmore. It's very similar, as I was pointing to, of the Fabriano cold press. So that's a beautiful paper to work on. And then my final choice, of course, would be the Arches, which has the coarse cold press texture. This video does complete my series of testing for watercolor markers and blendability on the various watercolor paper samples I was able to acquire or already had. I hope you found it enjoyable, and if so, please click on the thumbs up and subscribe. I really would appreciate it. It helped me out a lot. Guess the only thing left now is no more testing. We need to start making art with these markers. So that's going to be next one up. Until then, you have a great day.